On October 14th, 2025, Zoran OS 18 arrived with a peculiar new option buried inside its polished appearance tool in plain sight. Among 12 switchable desktop layouts was one modeled after Linux Mint, the distribution famous for resisting desktop fashion. The gesture looked friendly and almost flattering, but it exposed a deeper disagreement about what freedom on a personal computer means. Zoran's answer was flexibility. Make Linux resemble whatever users already know, then remove the fear of leaving Windows behind. Mint's answer had been almost the opposite. Stop redesigning the desktop around trends and let users keep a stable mental model. Both claimed to put the owner back in control, yet they were solving the same problem through radically different instincts. One treated familiarity as a bridge that could be reshaped. The other treated familiarity as infrastructure that should not move. And that distinction matters because digital sovereignty is not just about whether source code is visible or a license is free. It is about who decides how your machine changes, where software comes from, what services it depends on, and what happens when vendors change direction. By 2026, this was no abstract argument. Windows users were confronting tighter cloud integration, account pressure, and expanding platform dependence. Linux offered an exit, but the exit itself raised a harder question. Does sovereignty come from maximum choice or from disciplined refusal? Zoran OS 18.1, released in April 2026, represented the most refined version of the bridge-building philosophy available in 2026. Linux Mint 22.3, released 3 months earlier, represented the opposite kind of maturity, evolution without surrendering its center. Neither project was actually fighting the other. There was no feud, no lawsuit, no hostile fork, no public declaration of war. The conflict was architectural and philosophical, visible in defaults, package sources, desktop design, and contingency planning. To understand which approach protects users better, the glossy themes have to disappear, and the trust relationships underneath must be mapped. Because every operating system is a chain of dependencies, and sovereignty depends on how many links you can replace when one fails. The most revealing clue is not Zoran's Windows-like polish or Mint's familiar panel. It is what each project is willing to say no to. And the answer begins 14 years before Zoran copied Mint's silhouette, when Linux itself was arguing over the future of the desktop. In January 2012, the Linux Mint team introduced Cinnamon after growing dissatisfied with the direction of GNOME shell itself. Instead of accepting the new interaction model, Mint forked GNOME technology and rebuilt the experience around familiar desktop habits. That choice established a pattern still visible today. When upstream direction threatens workflow, Mint is willing to build its own path. Mint was not trying to freeze software in amber. It was asserting that upstream innovation did not automatically deserve authority over user habits. When a major desktop project changed the interface, Mint's response was not to train users to accept the new paradigm. It was to preserve the workflow and adapt the technology underneath it. That is a subtle but important form of sovereignty. Linux Mint blog. This is why calling Mint merely conservative misses the mechanism. Its conservatism is not simply slow release cadence. It is a governance choice. Changes are filtered through the question of whether they improve the user's existing workflow without forcing a new one. Even Mint's own language emphasizes comfort, centralized updates, system snapshots, and the principle that the computer should follow the owner rather than the reverse. Linux Mint, Zoran approached the same migration problem from another angle. Instead of creating one strongly defended desktop identity, it built a customization layer capable of presenting several identities. A Windows user can choose a Windows-like layout. Someone more comfortable with macOS can select a different arrangement. Zoran OS 18 Pro expanded that logic to 12 layouts, including one explicitly inspired by Linux Mint, Zoran blog. That distinction changes the argument. Zoran does not ask users to surrender kernel ownership in exchange for familiarity. It uses familiarity to reduce switching friction. The design goal is not to make Windows permanent, but to make the first day without Windows less disorienting. For individuals and organizations, that can convert theoretical freedom into an exit people are actually willing to take. Sovereignty that nobody adopts is politically elegant and practically weak. A technically perfect escape route has limited value if ordinary users refuse to cross it. Zoran's strongest case is therefore not that flexible layouts are inherently freer than Mint's stable desktop. It is that usability can be a strategic tool for breaking dependence on a dominant vendor. This becomes clearer in Zoran's support for Windows applications. Its optional Windows app support uses Wine to run many .exe and .msi programs. That could be interpreted as preserving Windows dependence inside Linux. But Zoran's own documentation recommends checking for a native Linux version first, and then trying a native alternative before relying on Windows compatibility. Zoran help. That order matters. Wine can function as a decompression chamber during migration. A business with one legacy utility does not need to postpone leaving Windows until every workflow has been replaced. It can move the operating system first, keep the legacy application temporarily, and substitute native software later. In sovereignty terms, compatibility can reduce the cost of saying no to the original platform. But compatibility can also become a trap if the temporary layer becomes permanent. An organization that moves to Linux yet remains dependent on Microsoft file formats, proprietary cloud services, Windows-only business software, and identity systems may have changed the kernel without changing the power structure. Zoran lowers the first barrier, but the user still has to complete the migration. The real philosophical divide therefore appears in defaults. Zoran assumes that reducing friction creates freedom. Mint assumes that carefully chosen constraints protect freedom. Neither principle is automatically correct. The question is whether those defaults increase the user's ability to change suppliers, inspect dependencies, reject unwanted infrastructure, and keep the machine useful when outside vendors alter their terms. Package management reveals the difference more sharply than desktop layout. Zoran OS 18.1 supports apt packages, Flatpak, Snap, .deb files, app images, Windows executables through the optional compatibility layer, and web apps. Its built-in software store can draw from Zoran and Ubuntu repositories, FlatHub, and the Snap Store out of the box. Zoran. That breadth is convenient, but convenience creates a more complicated trust map. An application installed from Ubuntu's repositories follows one release and signing pipeline. A Flatpak from FlatHub follows another. A Snap comes through another distribution system. An app image may come directly from a developer. A Windows executable can introduce an entirely separate software ecosystem. The user gains roots, but also more provenance to evaluate. Linux Mint made that issue unusually explicit in 2020 when it objected to Ubuntu's handling of Chromium through Snap. Mint argued that an apt package should not silently install Snap infrastructure and redirect users into another store without clear consent. In response, Mint blocked Snapd from being installed automatically through apt, while still allowing users to install it manually if they chose. Linux Mint blog. That episode is one of the strongest pieces of evidence in Mint's favor. The project accepted inconvenience in order to defend the boundary between a user's chosen package system and a vendor-controlled distribution channel. It treated informed consent at the package manager level as more important than making one application easier to obtain. That is sovereignty expressed as refusal. There is an irony, however. To protect user choice, Mint itself imposed a default restriction. A system that blocks automatic Snapd installation is still making a policy decision on the user's behalf. The difference is that the restriction is reversible, documented, and aimed at preventing another mechanism from being introduced without consent. Mint is curating the gate in order to prevent the gate from disappearing. Zoran chooses the opposite risk. It exposes the Snap Store alongside other sources and lets convenience dominate the first-run experience. That does not mean Zoran hands control of the operating system to Canonical. Snap support is one software route among several. But it does mean a default Zoran user can become dependent on an application channel Mint deliberately keeps outside the default trust boundary. Mint's caution is not limited to Snap. In 2024, the project changed how its software manager presented unverified Flatpaks after raising concerns about users misunderstanding who actually maintained certain packages. The team decided that unverified Flatpaks should not appear by default and should be clearly marked when enabled. Again, convenience lost to provenance. Linux Mint blog. This reveals the deeper Mint pattern. The project repeatedly tries to make trust relationships legible. It does not merely ask whether an application runs. It asks who built it, who updates it, and whether the user understands that relationship. Digital sovereignty is not achieved by having thousands of install buttons. It requires knowing which institution stands behind each one. The security consequence is therefore not a simple winner and loser story. Mint reduces some supply chain ambiguity by narrowing and labeling defaults. Zoran increases accessibility by aggregating ecosystems. A careful Zoran user can still choose only apt and verified Flatpaks. A careless Mint user can still install unsafe third-party software manually. Philosophy shapes the safe path, but it does not abolish responsibility. Now the analysis reaches a more structural layer, dependency on Ubuntu. Both mainstream Linux Mint and Zoran OS are built on Ubuntu LTS foundations. Zoran OS 18.1 uses Ubuntu 24.04 LTS, while Linux Mint 22.3 belongs to the Ubuntu Noble package base. That shared foundation gives both projects mature repositories, hardware enablement, security maintenance, and enormous ecosystem compatibility. Zoran. But digital sovereignty is tested by failure scenarios, not normal operation. What happens if the upstream project changes direction? What if packaging policy shifts, components disappear, or business priorities diverge from downstream users? A distribution that depends deeply on one upstream can be free software and still face strategic vulnerability if replacing that upstream would require years of reconstruction. Linux Mint has spent years building an answer to that problem, LMDE, the Linux Mint Debian Edition. The project states that LMDE exists specifically to ensure Mint can continue delivering the same experience if Ubuntu were ever to disappear, while measuring how much work would be required to operate without Ubuntu. LMDE 7 uses Debian rather than Ubuntu as its package base. Linux Mint, that is perhaps Mint's strongest sovereignty asset because it transforms independence from rhetoric into maintained engineering capacity. The project does not merely claim that it could fork away from Ubuntu. It continuously produces a parallel edition that proves much of its desktop stack, tools, and user experience can survive on a different foundation. Zoran's public product line does not present an equivalent Debian-based parallel distribution. Its current supported releases remain tied to Ubuntu LTS bases. That does not make Zoran captive in the proprietary sense. Ubuntu itself is built from free and open source components, and downstream distributions can modify them. But organizationally, Zoran has fewer visible escape routes if its relationship with the Ubuntu base became strategically uncomfortable. Zoran invests that engineering effort elsewhere. It builds the migration surface, layout switching, compatibility tools, polished defaults, and guidance for organizations moving from Windows. Its official documentation even provides a staged process for businesses and schools to test Zoran, identify applications, deploy alternatives, roll out the operating system, and manage machines. The project is optimizing for the moment of escape. Zoran help. Privacy strengthens Mint's case, but must be described carefully. Linux Mint publicly states that it does not collect user data and frames your computer, your rules, as a core principle. That is stronger language than simply promising secure storage or anonymized analytics. It places non-collection itself inside the product philosophy, Linux Mint. Zoran also markets itself as privacy-respecting and positions the operating system as an alternative to Windows and Mac OS. Historically, Zoran has taken privacy-oriented steps, such as disabling Firefox tracking and telemetry defaults in earlier releases. But sovereignty should not be decided by slogans alone. The more durable question is whether the user can continue operating the machine without an identity service, proprietary activation channel, or mandatory cloud account controlling basic access. Zoran. On that test, both systems are fundamentally different from account-centric proprietary desktop platforms. Their core value does not depend on binding the local login to a commercial cloud identity. The machine remains a general-purpose Linux computer. Users can install software from multiple sources, access local files directly, run servers, change desktops, modify system packages, and replace components without requesting permission from a platform owner. The paid Zoran Pro Edition introduces a useful philosophical test. Charging money for software does not reduce digital sovereignty by itself. Free software has never required zero price. The real questions are whether payment creates technical lock-in, whether essential control is withheld, and whether the user can keep using the underlying system without continuous authorization from the seller. Zoran Pro mainly differentiates itself with additional layouts, bundled applications, artwork, and support. The existence of a commercial tier can actually strengthen project sustainability if revenue funds development. But it also changes the psychology of interface customization. Some forms of familiarity become a premium product. Mint's desktop, by contrast, is funded through donations, sponsorships, advertising relationships, and community support while remaining free of charge. Zoran. The desktop itself creates another paradox. Mint's resistance to radical interface change can protect users from churn, but conservatism can also delay transitions that eventually become necessary. Display servers, graphics stacks, audio systems, security frameworks, and hardware support evolve. Refusing change forever would turn stability into stagnation and eventually undermine security rather than preserve it. Mint's current behavior shows that its conservatism is selective rather than absolute. Linux Mint 22.3 was released as a long-term support release, and the project has continued publishing hardware enablement images with newer kernels. In 2026, it was also actively working on Wayland improvements for future releases. The project moves, but it tries to control the timing and absorb disruption before handing it to users. Linux Mint blog. This is why interface resemblance is a poor measure of technological dependence. A user can run a Windows-like panel on a system that is completely independent of Microsoft services. Conversely, someone can run an aggressively novel Linux desktop while depending on proprietary cloud storage, closed collaboration tools, Microsoft document formats, and browser-based SaaS for every important task. Sovereignty lives deeper than the wallpaper. A better measure is exit cost. How difficult is it to leave the distribution itself? Can data be moved? Can applications be replaced? Can the desktop be changed? Can the package sources be altered? Can the system continue functioning if the project disappears? Can another maintainer reconstruct the experience from available code and standard components? Mint scores strongly because much of its identity is built from open components it develops publicly, especially Cinnamon and its XApps ecosystem, while LMDE demonstrates portability beyond Ubuntu. Its emphasis on APT and Flatpak, explicit repository choices, local accounts, and ordinary Linux file systems gives experienced users clear escape routes. Even the project's own homepage points users towards source code for distributed packages. Linux Mint. Zoran also scores well, though for different reasons. Under the visual customization, Core and Pro use GNOME Shell, Lite uses XFCE, and the system rests on standard Ubuntu foundations. Applications can come from standard Linux packaging ecosystems rather than a single mandatory Zoran-only store. A user who outgrows Zoran can move data and workflows to another Linux distribution without crossing the kind of proprietary wall found in closed platforms. Zoran. The largest sovereignty question around Zoran is therefore not lock-in to Zoran. It is whether its convenient strategy encourages users to keep dependencies they should eventually replace. Snap packages, Windows executables, web apps, and proprietary cross-platform software can make migration painless, but they can also preserve outside control points. The bridge works best when people eventually step off it. Mint's largest weakness is the mirror image. Its protective curation can become a form of paternalism if users confuse project defaults with universal truth. Blocking automatic Snap adoption protected consent, but some users genuinely prefer Snap and its update model. Hiding unverified Flatpaks by default reduces risk, yet power users may value access more than curation. Sovereignty includes the right to make informed decisions the distributor dislikes. Mint generally preserves that possibility, which is why the distinction between blocked by default and forbidden is crucial. Snap can still be installed manually. Unverified Flatpaks can still be exposed. Cinnamon can be customized with extensions, applets, themes, and desklets. The project pushes users toward a conservative safe path, but does not seal the exits. Linux Mint blog. This distinction becomes critical in organizations. A school considering migration from Windows may care less about philosophical purity than training cost. If Zoran can make a classroom or office feel familiar enough that staff accept the transition, the organization may escape licensing pressure and hardware churn sooner. In that context, interface mimicry becomes a tool of institutional autonomy rather than a weakness. This is Zoran's strongest rebuttal to Mint's philosophy. Users do not experience governance diagrams. They experience whether their taskbars were expected, whether their files open, whether printers work, whether old applications launch, and whether they can finish a job on Monday morning. A migration that preserves productivity can create the political space for deeper technical independence later. Mint's strongest rebuttal is that transitional compromises have a habit of becoming permanent infrastructure. Organizations rarely return to eliminate a dependency that is already working. If Windows compatibility, a proprietary file format, or a centralized app store solves the immediate problem, the incentive to replace it declines. A bridge can become a settlement, and the old vendor can remain embedded in the new environment. That is why the best sovereignty strategy may combine the two philosophies sequentially. Use Zoran's logic at the boundary. Minimize friction, preserve enough familiarity to make departure realistic, support temporary compatibility, and avoid turning migration into an ideological endurance test. Then use Mint's logic after the move. Reduce unnecessary trust relationships, prefer transparent package provenance, stabilize the workflow, and build contingency paths away from upstream concentration. But the title demands a verdict, and the verdict depends on the word truly. If digital sovereignty means the greatest probability that a Windows user will successfully leave a proprietary desktop, Zoran may be the more effective instrument. It translates freedom into adoption. It understands that the first enemy of migration is not source code licensing, it is fear, retraining, and broken workflow. If digital sovereignty means the strongest long-term resistance to vendor-controlled infrastructure after migration, Linux Mint has the more coherent philosophy. Its history shows repeated willingness to absorb engineering cost and user inconvenience in order to preserve consent, provenance, workflow stability, and upstream optionality. Cinnamon was born from refusal. The Snap decision repeated that instinct. LMDE turns it into strategic redundancy. That does not make every Mint decision correct. It does not make Zoran less free. It means Mint has built more of its identity around the question, what happens if the upstream does something we reject? Zoran has built more of its identity around the question, how do we make the user comfortable enough to leave the upstream they already depend on? Both questions matter, but only one is a direct test of long-term autonomy. The difference can be stated as two threat models. Zoran's primary threat is migration failure. The user remains on Windows because Linux feels unfamiliar, applications fail, or organizational resistance becomes too expensive. Mint's primary threat is dependency creep. The user reaches Linux but gradually surrenders control again through opaque stores, forced workflows, upstream decisions, or convenient services. Against migration failure, Zoran is exceptionally well designed. Its appearance system, broad package support, Windows compatibility, and organizational migration guidance all attack the practical reasons users stay where they are. Against dependency creep, Mint's stricter defaults and public skepticism toward silent infrastructure changes provide stronger defenses. The operating system is not just welcoming the user, it is policing the conditions under which outside authority enters. Zoran blog. The most important evidence remains LMDE because it exposes the difference between branding and contingency. When Mint says it wants to reduce dependence on upstream decisions, it maintains a Debian-based edition specifically to measure and preserve the ability to operate without Ubuntu. That is an engineering answer to a governance problem. It is expensive, imperfect, and far more meaningful than a slogan. Linux Mint. Zoran could theoretically change its base in the future, and its use of open Linux components makes that possible. But sovereignty is about prepared options, not merely legal possibilities. A parachute packed, inspected, and periodically tested is more valuable than the knowledge that fabric exists somewhere in the building. Mint has been testing its parachute for years. That cultural layer may be Mint's greatest contribution. When a project publicly treats unnoticed infrastructure changes as unacceptable, it teaches users that convenience is not the highest value. When it distinguishes verified from unverified packages, it teaches that an application name is not enough. Maintainership matters. When it maintains LMDE, it teaches that dependence should be measured before it becomes a crisis. Zoran teaches something equally important. Freedom that requires cultural conversion before installation will not scale. The majority of people do not leave Windows because they suddenly develop a theory of software governance. They leave when another system lets them keep working. Zoran turns familiarity into leverage, and that leverage can move entire households, schools, and offices onto a user-controlled Linux foundation. The two projects therefore occupy different positions in the same escape architecture. Zoran is optimized for the door. Mint is optimized for the room beyond it. One makes departure from a proprietary platform less frightening. The other makes it harder for new forms of control to quietly become normal once the user has arrived. That is why the Linux Mint-like layout inside Zoran OS 18 is more than a visual curiosity. It demonstrates that Zoran can absorb another project's interface philosophy as one selectable option. But Mint's philosophy cannot be reduced to the placement of a panel or the shape of a menu. Its deeper identity lies in the governance decisions that produced that interface and the boundaries it refuses to surrender. At the same time, a Mint installation cannot instantly copy Zoran's migration machinery. It does not offer the same breadth of one-click identity switching or position Windows compatibility as centrally in the onboarding experience. Mint expects the user to meet Linux slightly more on Linux's terms. For many users, that is healthy. For some, it is exactly the friction that prevents migration. So the final judgment is not that one distribution is secure and the other is compromised. Both can be configured securely. Both can be used badly. Both depend on large upstream ecosystems. Both benefit from open source development. Both remain vulnerable to the ordinary realities of browser tracking, proprietary applications, bad passwords, malicious downloads, compromised repositories, and human error. Digital sovereignty is narrower and deeper than cybersecurity. It asks who retains the final authority to change the system, replace suppliers, reject infrastructure, preserve local access, and continue operating when business models shift. On those terms, Linux Mint's philosophy offers the stronger long-term shield because it repeatedly sacrifices convenience to preserve reversibility and consent. Zoran's philosophy remains indispensable because a shield is useless if people never reach it. Its polished layouts and compatibility layers lower the social and operational cost of leaving Windows. In many real migrations, Zoran may produce more sovereignty in practice simply because it gets more users across the line. That is not a contradiction. It is the difference between acquisition and retention of autonomy. The ideal future Linux desktop may need both instincts at once. Zoran's empathy for the person escaping a familiar platform and Mint's suspicion of every dependency that tries to become permanent. Ease should bring users in. Transparency should keep them free. Compatibility should be temporary where possible. Contingency should be designed before it is needed. Return to October 14th, 2025. Zoran OS 18 offered a Linux Mint-like layout as one of 12 ways to arrange the same underlying machine. The visual message was that users should not have to change themselves before they can change operating systems. That was a powerful idea, and it captured Zoran's philosophy perfectly. Zoran blog. But the deeper lesson sits underneath the layout switcher. Sovereignty does not come from how many faces an operating system can wear. It comes from whether the owner can reject the next unwanted change, replace the next unwanted supplier, and keep the machine useful without asking permission from the institution that once seemed indispensable. On that test, Linux Mint wins the philosophical contest by a narrow but meaningful margin. Zoran builds the better bridge out of vendor dependence. Mint builds the stronger defenses against rebuilding that dependence after the crossing. The most sovereign computer is not the one that offers the most choices on day one. It is the one that keeps your right to say no intact on day 1000.